For more than a century, Australian cattle farming has been woven into the fabric of rural life. Families have worked the land, built communities, and supplied the world with some of the finest beef. But over the past decade, a series of policy decisions and regulatory changes have systematically dismantled what generations built, leaving thousands of family farmers struggling to survive. This is the story of how rules meant to protect, modernize, and regulate the industry actually destroyed it. The crisis we're witnessing today didn't happen overnight. It's the result of a cascade of decisions that began in earnest during the 1980s with the deregulation of agricultural industries. The government stepped back, the free market stepped forward, and slowly but surely the consolidation began. What started as a trickle became a flood. Small abattoirs closed, processing plants consolidated, multinational corporations moved in. But the real breaking point came much more recently, and it revealed just how fragile the entire system had become. In January of 2025, the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance sounded an alarm that shook the entire agricultural sector. They announced that 6 abattoirs had closed their doors to service kills in just 4 months. Cowra in New South Wales, Booyong in New South Wales, Canawindra in New South Wales, DBC in Western Australia, Tammin in Western Australia, and Hardwicks in Victoria. Each closure represented not just the loss of a facility, but the destruction of a livelihood for hundreds of small-scale farmers who depended on these operations. But these weren't random closures. They were strategic business decisions by multinational corporations who had seized control of Australia's meat processing sector. Hardwicks, owned by the multinational Kilcoy, simply made the decision to stop accepting small-scale farmers. They wanted volume. They wanted standardization. They wanted the kind of supply chains that only massive operations could provide. In December 2024, they kicked out the small farmers. No warning, no negotiation. Just a decision that would alter the course of hundreds of rural families' lives forever. Dr. Tammy Jonas, a heritage breed pig and cattle farmer whose husband Stuart is building a micro abattoir on their farm, expressed the frustration felt across the sector. She pointed out that the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance had been submitting proposed reforms for about 7 years. 7 years. They tried to warn the government. They tried to propose solutions. But the government wasn't listening. Not until there was a crisis. And when the crisis came, it was too late for hundreds of farmers affected by these closures with nowhere to turn. The implications of this abattoir collapse stretch far beyond just the farmers who lost their processing options. This represents a fundamental threat to Australian food security and food sovereignty. In a country that exports 72% of what it produces, what happens when that figure reaches 90%? What does the average Australian eat if farmers don't have access to the basic infrastructure that's intrinsic to agriculture? When there are no abattoirs, no boning rooms, no dairy processing facilities, and no grain mills, the entire domestic food system becomes fragile and dependent on imports or expensive supermarket chains. Think about what this means for the future of rural Australia. The closure of local abattoirs and processing facilities directly threatens the existence of small-scale livestock farmers. Without these infrastructure points, farmers have only one option: sell to the multinational corporations or get out of farming altogether. And when small-scale farmers disappear, entire rural communities hollow out. The local butcher shops that have served families for generations close down. Farmers' markets lose their suppliers. Community-supported agriculture programs collapse. The knowledge of whole carcass butchery, a craft that takes years to master, dies with the craftspeople who practice it. This trend, according to the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance, is part of a pattern that started with deregulation in the 1980s, but it has accelerated dramatically in the last few years. Decades of industry consolidation have been followed by several multinational acquisitions, leaving small-scale farmers with few, if any, remaining slaughter options. The market became more concentrated while farmers became more vulnerable. This is what happens when governments prioritize export markets over domestic food security. This is what happens when they allow corporations to consolidate without checking their power. This is the real cost of the hands-off approach to agricultural regulation. But the abattoir crisis is only one part of the story. Simultaneously, Australian cattle producers are being squeezed by rising input costs that have made it increasingly difficult to maintain profitable operations. The numbers are stark and telling. Average farm cash costs have more than doubled from $329,000 in 1990 to $738,000 in 2025. That's a 124% increase in 35 years. For cattle producers specifically, the average farm cash costs sit at approximately $409,000 per year. Now, within that cost structure, fodder and freight are the dominant pressures for cattle farms. Unlike cropping operations where fertilizer and fuel are the biggest concerns, fodder accounts for around $42,000 of annual costs. Freight represents about $19,000. Fuel, another $19,000. These might sound like reasonable proportions, but when you're running a margin-based operation, especially in a volatile market, even small increases in these costs can be the difference between profit and bankruptcy. As of April 2026, rising input costs are hitting cattle producers particularly hard. Fodder costs have been climbing steadily. Feed grain prices are trending higher. Darling Downs wheat prices are currently around $361 per ton, the highest level since mid-2024. While prices remain below the peaks seen during the Russia-Ukraine war, the upward trajectory is clear and concerning. Cattle producers understand that higher grain prices eventually translate into higher fodder costs, and those costs will hit them in the latter part of 2026, following the 2026 winter crop harvest, when final tonnages become clear both in Australia and globally. This timing is particularly crucial because cattle farmers are in a vulnerable position. They're currently experiencing elevated female slaughter rates, with the 12-month rolling average sitting at 53%, well above the long-term average of 47%. This means they're selling more breeding stock than they should be, trying to generate cash flow to pay for inputs. It's a short-term solution that creates long-term problems. Once you sell your breeding stock, it takes years to rebuild your herd. But when costs are rising and markets are uncertain, many farmers see no alternative. The government seems largely asleep to these realities. While ministers for agriculture and primary industry across Australia assure the farming community that they are concerned about the situation, they appear to lack the political will to act decisively. They haven't implemented the recommendations from the 2023 parliamentary inquiry into Australian food security, which included specific recommendations aimed at fostering localized food systems. The government is yet to respond to that report, and consumers as well as small-scale farmers continue to suffer the consequences. Beyond the immediate pressures of costs and market consolidation, cattle producers are also facing a new and mounting regulatory burden that reflects broader environmental and political concerns. The federal government has committed to the 30 by 30 target, outlined in its Nature Positive Plan, which aims to protect 30% of land by 2030. This is where things get complicated. Environmental protection is important, but when these policies are implemented without genuine consultation with the land managers who actually steward 50% of Australia's land and water, the results can be devastating. Cattle Australia, the peak industry body, has been advocating strongly that land managers must not be left out of the loop in the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act overhaul. They argue, and reasonably so, that the 52,000 cattle producers and the hundreds of thousands of people employed in the beef supply chain deserve to have a say in how environmental policy is implemented. These are the people who have been managing Australia's vast landscapes, producing high-quality, safe, and sustainable beef for generations. They feel a deep personal responsibility for protecting the environment. But if they're excluded from the policy-making process, the outcomes are likely to be unrealistic, unworkable, and ultimately counterproductive. The cattle industry is particularly worried about how the 30 by 30 target will be applied to working lands. If the government designates large areas of productive cattle country as protected areas without alternative income sources or a transition period, it will force farmers off their land. This is exactly the kind of policy failure that destroys rural communities. It's environmental ideology meeting agricultural reality, and reality is losing. Environmental regulation isn't the only regulatory burden weighing on cattle producers. In 2025, new biosecurity and compliance requirements have added another layer of complexity and cost to operations. Every property must now register a property identification code, an 8-character code that links to the National Livestock Identification System database. Moving herds requires a national vendor declaration and a waybill that proves ownership history and health status. These systems have legitimate purposes in preventing disease and ensuring traceability from paddock to plate. But here's where the regulation becomes punitive. Missed tags and incomplete documentation can result in fines starting at $1,320 per animal under the Livestock Act 2023. For a producer moving a herd of 500 animals, that's a potential fine of $600 and $60,000 for administrative errors. One Victorian producer shared that scanning every beast at loading saves hours during audits, but that level of compliance requires investment in technology, labor, and training. For small farmers already stretched thin financially, these compliance costs represent a barrier to doing business. The regulatory framework, which includes the Australian Animal Welfare Standards and Guidelines for Cattle, was endorsed by state and territory governments in 2016 and has been or is being regulated into law by most state and territory governments. While animal welfare is undoubtedly important, the implementation of these standards has created a patchwork of requirements that varies by state. Some states regulated the standards as mandatory codes of practice. Others incorporated them into their existing animal welfare legislation with minor variations. A large number of stakeholders, including welfare organizations, livestock industry representatives, and service providers, were involved in shaping these guidelines. A decision. Regulation Impact Statement was developed and endorsed by the Commonwealth Office of Best Practice Regulation. The standards were intended to help protect the welfare of cattle, and in principle, this is laudable. But the cumulative effect of these regulations, combined with rising costs, market consolidation, and environmental restrictions, is that smaller producers can't compete. They can't afford the infrastructure investments, they can't absorb the compliance costs, they can't meet the production scale that multinational corporations demand. One particularly contentious historical decision that continues to reverberate through the industry is the 2011 live export ban. When then Agriculture Minister Joe Ludwig made the sudden decision in May 2011 to suspend live animal exports in response to negative media coverage, it resulted in significant disruption to the livestock supply chain across northern Australia. This wasn't a gradual policy change with transition support. It was an immediate ban that devastated cattle producers, who had built their entire business models around live export markets. The anger from farmers was palpable and eventually found expression in legal action. In July 2017, a group of cattle farmers sued the Australian government for $600 million in compensation. Their argument was straightforward. The decision to suspend live cattle exports was irrational, disproportionate, and unjustified, and they were right. In June 2020, a federal court ruled in their favor. Justice Rares, in delivering his judgment, described the ban order as capricious and unreasonable. But while the court validated the farmers' complaint, it was too late for many. The markets were gone, the business arrangements had been dissolved, the damage to rural communities was already done. The live export story reveals a pattern in how agricultural policy is made in Australia. Decisions are made rapidly, often in response to media events or international pressure, without genuine consultation with the producers who will bear the costs. There's an assumption that government knows best, that the market should be punished, that rural communities will simply absorb the shock and move on, but they don't absorb it. They suffer it. Farms fail. Families leave agriculture. Rural towns decline. Today, Australia remains the world's largest live exporter of animals for slaughter, though the trade remains controversial. The government is planning to phase out the live sheep trade, with Australia stopping the export of live sheep from May 1st, 2028. This is another policy change that creates uncertainty for producers and their lenders. How do you plan a business when the government keeps changing the rules? The current state of the Australian cattle industry reflects all of these pressures converging simultaneously. As of the latest projections from 2025 and 2026, the Australian cattle herd is projected at above 30 million head in 2026, with slaughter forecast at 9.45 million, the highest level in almost 5 decades. But this peak in production is followed by a projected decline. ABRS forecasts beef production to fall 6% in 2026-2027 as slaughter eases and the herd starts to decline. This marks the cycle pivot from peak supply. But here's the critical insight that most policymakers seem to miss. The decline isn't driven by market forces alone. It's driven by farmers making rational decisions to exit the industry or reduce their herds because the economics no longer work. When you add together rising input costs, regulatory burdens, market consolidation that destroys their processing options, environmental restrictions on land use, and uncertainty about future policy, rational farmers decide to get out. They sell off breeding stock. They don't rebuild. They retire or move into different enterprises. This is particularly happening with female slaughter rates, sitting at 53%, well above historical averages. Producers are maintaining elevated female slaughter in response to strong prices and weak margins. They're selling cattle they should be keeping, but they're doing this because they need cash, and they're uncertain about the future. If I'm a cattle producer in 2026 and I don't know whether the government will restrict my land use further, whether input costs will continue rising, whether I'll have access to processing facilities next year, whether compliance costs will spike again, I'm not going to invest in rebuilding my breeding herd. I'm going to maximize short-term cash flow and hope things improve. The succession wave hitting iconic pastoral holdings across Australia compounds this crisis. Massive family operations that have been running for generations are now facing succession decisions at a time when the industry is increasingly difficult to operate profitably. The McLaughlin family, which founded Jumbuck Pastoral in 1888 and built Australia's third largest landholding operation, is now listing a contiguous 1.29 million hectare aggregation across 3 South Australian stations as part of an orderly succession plan, dividing properties among patriarch Hugh McLaughlin's children. This represents the end of an era. These aren't small farmers exiting the industry. These are massive, sophisticated operations that have survived droughts, depressions, wars, and market collapses. If even they're deciding that the current regulatory and economic environment is too difficult to pass on to the next generation, what does that say about the viability of family farming in Australia? Corporate agricultural companies are stepping in to fill the gap. Australian Agricultural Company, the ASX-listed operator of massive pastoral holdings, posted a record $71.6 million profit for the 2025-2026 financial year. Branded beef sales were up 8%, driven by Wagyu premiumization and export channel diversification. The big get bigger while the small get squeezed out. This is the inexorable logic of consolidation when government steps back and lets markets run without guardrails. The processing bottleneck remains a critical vulnerability in the Australian beef system. Growth in herd numbers across northern Australia over the past 4 to 5 years has exceeded growth in processing capacity. This leaves the cattle-producing sector exposed in the event of forced turnoff due to dry conditions. With growth in the herd and the ongoing lift in feedlot numbers, the processing sector needs to reinvest some of its profits from the past 2 years to improve infrastructure. But here's the problem. If the major processing corporations are consolidating and choosing not to service small-scale farmers, they have little incentive to invest in processing capacity in rural areas. They want centralized operations that can handle massive volumes with minimum labor. Rural abattoirs serving local farmers don't fit their business model. This is where the abattoir crisis becomes existential. It's not just about farmers losing processing options. It's about the entire value chain reorganizing around serving export markets and multinational retail chains rather than local communities. When all the processing happens in a few centralized locations owned by multinationals, the economics change. They decide which farmers they'll work with. They set the prices. They control the product specification. Individual farmers become commodities rather than partners. Global trade dynamics are adding another layer of uncertainty to the industry outlook. Australia's live cattle export sector remains supported by strong supply fundamentals and selective regional demand, but the outlook depends heavily on factors largely outside farmers' control. Indonesia is Australia's largest market for live cattle, but it's also vulnerable to disease outbreaks. In 2023, lumpy skin disease was detected in Indonesian cattle that originated from Australia. This forced Indonesian authorities to remove market access for further livestock imports into Indonesia until Australian authorities could prove that the cattle hadn't been infected in Australia and that the source of disease was in Indonesia. If the disease was found in Australian livestock, all exports of live cattle, meat, and dairy would be halted. That's an existential threat to the entire industry. Meanwhile, in North American and North Asian markets, Australia faces different pressures. Reduced U.S. beef production and constrained Mexican imports are expected to boost demand for Australian beef in North America and North Asia. But this opportunity is threatened by competition. Brazil is improving its market access and has been diverted from other markets. Possible export restrictions by China that may affect global beef trade flows could also present challenges to Australian beef and cattle prices in 2026. The Trump administration's policies on trade are also relevant here. Trump has moved to remove the 40% tariff on Brazilian beef imports, meaning Brazilian beef will only face the 26.4% above quota tariff in the U.S. This will likely restore Brazilian beef imports back to previous levels, providing a lift in competition for Australian beef exports and putting pressure on Australian beef export returns. These are policy decisions made thousands of miles away by governments with different priorities, but they directly affect the profitability of Australian cattle farmers. What we're witnessing is a systematic dismantling of the infrastructure and certainty that small and medium-sized cattle farmers need to operate successfully. It's not happening by accident. It's the result of deliberate policy choices. The decision to prioritize export markets over domestic food. Security, the decision to allow unlimited consolidation of processing facilities. The decision to implement environmental and biosecurity regulations without adequate consultation or transition support. The decision to change live export policy without compensation. Each decision might have seemed reasonable in isolation. Consolidation improves efficiency. Environmental protection is important. Biosecurity matters. But taken together, they create an impossible operating environment for family farmers. They can't compete with corporate operators. They can't access processing facilities. They can't absorb rising input costs. They can't navigate the regulatory maze, so they exit. Rural Australia is being hollowed out, and the government seems content to let it happen. The 2023 parliamentary inquiry into Australian food security identified the problem and recommended solutions, but the government hasn't responded. The Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance has been warning about the abattoir crisis for 7 years, but nothing was done until there was a crisis. And when the crisis came, the government was still unprepared. The implications extend far beyond rural communities. Though the impact there is devastating enough, Food security and food sovereignty are national security issues. If Australia becomes dependent on imported food or a handful of multinational corporations for its domestic food supply, it's vulnerable. The COVID-19 pandemic showed us how fragile supply chains can be. The ongoing international conflicts show us that trade can be disrupted or weaponized. When you concentrate control of food production in the hands of a small number of corporations, you create a vulnerability. Local food systems built on networks of small and medium-sized producers, diverse supply chains, local processing, and direct connections between farmers and consumers are more resilient. They're more adaptable. When one supply chain fails, others can fill the gap. But the current policy regime is actively destroying these local systems. It's consolidating production into fewer hands, centralizing processing, and making it impossible for small farmers to compete. The Australian cattle producers who are still operating today are remarkable people. Many are fourth, fifth, and sixth generation farmers who have maintained deep knowledge of their land, their animals, and their communities. They're innovators who have adopted new technologies like satellite monitoring and automated water systems while maintaining traditional ecological knowledge about land management and animal husbandry. They practice rotational grazing that prevents overgrazing. They invest in biosecurity protocols and traceability systems. They embrace sustainable practices not because the government mandates them, but because they understand that the health of their land is the foundation of their business. But no amount of innovation or good practice is enough when the policy environment is hostile, and when input costs are rising faster than output prices, when your processing options are disappearing, when regulatory compliance is eating up your profits, when you can't access capital because lenders see the industry as increasingly risky. That's when even the best farmers throw in the towel. The consolidation of Australia's cattle industry is not inevitable. It's not the natural result of market forces. It's the result of specific policy choices made by governments that prioritized export markets, allowed unlimited corporate consolidation, and failed to invest in local food infrastructure. Different choices could produce different outcomes. Support for local abattoirs and processing facilities, regulations on consolidation to preserve competitive markets, transition support for farmers facing policy changes, investment in skills and infrastructure for local food systems. These are all options that governments could pursue, but they haven't. Instead, they've allowed the systematic dismantling of rural Australia. Farms that supported families for generations are being consolidated into corporate holdings. Small processors are being closed down by multinationals. Farmers are being pushed out of the industry because they can't compete with the scale and resources of large corporations. Rural towns are losing population and economic vitality as agricultural jobs disappear, and the government watches from Canberra as if this were just the natural operation of markets. But it's not natural, it's political. It's the result of choices made by people in power who prioritized global trade agreements over domestic food security, who trusted markets to handle consolidation without guardrails, who implemented regulations without considering the cumulative burden they placed on smaller operators. These were choices, and different choices could produce different outcomes. The rule changes that have gutted Australian cattle families aren't usually portrayed that way in the media. They're presented as necessary modernizations, environmental protections, or market efficiencies. But from the perspective of a cattle farmer watching their industry consolidate, their processing options disappear, their input costs soar, and their regulatory burden increase, these rules feel less like progress and more like death by 1,000 cuts. And the story isn't over. The Australian cattle herd is projected to decline by 2.2% in 2027. More farmers will exit, more communities will hollow out, more knowledge and traditions will be lost. The processing bottleneck will remain, export markets will become more uncertain, corporate consolidation will continue. Unless governments decide that family farming and local food systems are worth preserving, the current trajectory will continue. This is the cost of allowing agricultural policy to be made without genuine consultation with those who practice agriculture. This is the cost of prioritizing export markets over domestic food security. This is the cost of allowing corporations to consolidate without constraints. This is the cost of implementing regulations without transition support or consideration for cumulative burden. This is the rule change that gutted Australian cattle families, played out across a series of policy decisions made over decades, each one seemingly reasonable in isolation, but together creating an impossible operating environment for family farmers. The question now is whether Australia still wants to have family farming and a resilient local food system, or whether we're content to consolidate everything into the hands of a few corporate operators and hope that they'll serve us well. That's the real choice that lies ahead. But for now, in 2026, the answer is clear from the farmers themselves. They're leaving, and once they're gone, it will be very difficult to bring them back.